Hello everybody and welcome back to another Path of Exile 1 video. Today we're going to be going over the final update for the Bladestorm Champion League Start Guide that I put out for patch 3.26. Our character is now level 98. If I open up my challenges, you can see here that we've done 36 out of the 40 challenges, including killing 6 out of the 7 Uber bosses. The only one we haven't been able to kill so far is Uber Maven. That is more of a skill issue than a build issue. Everything else was doable, but full disclaimer guys, I do have 160 divines put into the build at this point, so there has been a lot of upgrades and a lot of currency spent since the last update video. In terms of gear, almost every piece has gotten an upgrade, the most expensive ones being the Celestial Brace. I believe this cost around 60 divines, and we also have the Awakened Multi-Strike support, which also was 60 divines the last I checked. So that is the majority of the currency spent on this build. Everything else is fairly affordable, you know, a couple divines here and there, and I'm going to be walking you through each one of them. In terms of our passive skill tree, we have a couple of changes. We are now pathing through the right side of the tree, and we have a bunch of new jewels in the build, like Immutable Force, we have a Cluster Jewel, and we have a Timeless Jewel, Lethal Pride over here. Alright, I'll talk about that when we get to the passive section of the build update. Let's start with the axe. This is a 30% quality Despot axe. The base eye level is 84. That's so we can roll some of the higher physical damage modifiers. I made this using Deafening Essences of Contempt and a little bit of Recombination. Basically, we have the flat physical damage from the Essence, and then we have the hybrid physical damage modifier from Recombination. Once you have both of that on the same item, you can put a multi-mod on it, and then put attack speed and the increased physical damage and chance to impale on hit mod on it. And that is how we made our axe. This is around 950 PDPS, which is really good for an endgame axe. You'll see here that the jewelry looks very much the same. The new thing here is the elemental resist we've gotten. So last time around we had life and then we had chaos resist. Now we have life, chaos resist, and another elemental resist. So we did this using the harvest horticrafting station. You put your accessories in there and you do chaos reforge. That guarantees that you get a chaos resist, and you just repeat that until you get it alongside the maximum life modifier. Now if you're smart, you'll do this on a fractured base. That means all you need to do is get the maximum life to roll alongside your chaos resistance and you'll be good to go. Make sure that these items have an open suffix so you can benchcraft +1 to minimum endurance charge, and that is the jewelry in the nutshell. The ring over here is a curse on hit ring. I'm going to talk about that when we go over the Celestial Brace upgrade we made for the glove slot. Alright, if you are still using the Hemophilia gloves, you should have your curse on hit through the corruption implicit. Alright, this is what we were using before. If you have something like this, you don't even need to worry about the curse on hit ring. Then the next upgrade we made was getting a armor evasion chest. If you go to the Perseverance Vanguard belt, you'll see here it has a unique modifier that gives us increased attack damage based on the lowest value of either our armor or evasion rating. Now previously we were using an armor chest and we weren't making any use of that belt modifier. By switching to armor evasion hybrid, our character now has 20k evasion and 18k armor, which means we're getting 90% attack damage from using this belt. Alright, so that is why we swapped into armor and evasion. Another thing you'll notice here is that all of my rare pieces have spell suppression. Spell suppression is not needed for this build. The build is plenty tanky for T16 and normal pinnacle content. The only reason I have spell suppression is so I could do Ubers. This does mean that I needed to spend a little bit more currency on my gear upgrades. These fractured bases on their own are 3 to 5 divines. I guess prices could have changed since I last made them. And then the crafting process is also not cheap. You'll see here that this helm has a abyssal socket. You get this using fossil crafting and prime resonators. So if I open up my delve tab over here, we don't have any prime resonators, but we used fossils to make our own alchemy orb, and then we used it on this hat, and then you had to do a couple of iterations to get something like this. So what this is going to do is the hollowed fossil gives you an abyssal socket, the sanctified fossil makes it so you're more likely to roll high tier mods, a prismatic fossil makes it so we have a higher chance of getting elemental resistances, and then the pristine fossil makes it so we have a higher chance of getting life modifiers. Okay, so you put all of this into your prime resonator, and then that's how you make this helmet over here. For our boots, we had a spell suppression fractured base, and then we used Deafening Essence of Loathing to get the chance to avoid elemental ailments mod on it. You spam this until you get it alongside a high tier resist, and then you protect the suffixes using Suffixes Cannot Be Changed, and then we use a Veiled Chaos Orb to get the increased movement speed. So then you finish up the item by putting on a plus life benchcraft, and you have something that looks like this. This is a very easy craft to make, it's just that the spell suppression base is quite expensive. If you're not doing spell suppression, then you're going to stick to something we had in the previous video, like this. It's going to have life, it's going to have double resist, and it's going to have the chance to avoid being shocked, okay? And you're going to use your Storm Shroud to get your ailment immunity. Once we swap to spell suppression, then we need the chance to avoid ailments, and then we're going to be using the Ancestral Vision Jewel so that our spell suppression also gives us chance to avoid ailments. So if I very quickly go over to the defense section of my character, you'll see here that we are ailment immune, and we do that using the boots on this build. Now that we've talked about the helm, the chest, and the boots that are giving us spell suppression, it's time to talk about the big elephant in the room, and that is the Celestial Brace. This is a unique item that drops from Uber Elder, and it has a very large variance, okay? You can roll from 1 to 10 maximum fortification. Because we're a champion, maximum fortification synergizes extremely well with our ascendancy. That is this one right here, Unstoppable Hero. We get 3% more armor, evasion, and increased attack speed for every fortification we get above 20. So with this build, I have 42 fortification. That is 22 times 3, 66 increased attack speed, and 66 more evasion and armor. So that is what Celestial Brace is allowing us to do. And that is also why it's worth like 60 divines for a high rolled unique. When I swapped to this unique, I lost my curse on hit from the Hemophilia gloves, so I had to incorporate that into my build using this Warlord influenced Amethyst ring. This is a base I bought for about 60 chaos, and then we use the Horticrafting bench. You're going to do Reforge Caster. You'll see that the cursed enemies with vulnerability on hit is a caster modifier, so you're going to Reforge Caster until you get the vulnerability on hit alongside the life and an elemental resist. I think that covers all of the rare items on this build. Here I have a open blue socket because I thought we could put in the Enlighten support. Turns out our character does not have enough intelligence to use Enlighten, so this is just an empty socket until we find a way to get Enlighten on the character. Enlighten is going to allow us to reserve less life. That means we can then take the Life Mastery, where you count on low life while at 55% of maximum life or below. Right now we're at 50% life. If we can get Enlighten into the build, we can then go to 55, and then we'll have a little bit of a higher hit pool against enemy monsters. Before we go into the passives, let's talk about the Flasks. Because we found a way of getting Corrupted Blood immunity through jewels, we're now using a Life Flask that grants poison immunity. The only thing that changed in the Flask department is that we added this Jade Flask because we now have chance to gain phasing on kill using the Abyssal Jewel in our Helm. This is also where we're getting the Corrupted Blood immunity. So you'll see here, 7% chance to gain phasing for 4 seconds on kill. We no longer need that Quartz Flask we had before. Jade Flask is going to make us a little bit more tanky, and it's going to give us a little bit more damage from the Perseverance Vanguard belt. Like I said before, baseline, we have 18,000 armor and 20,000 evasion. If I use both of my flasks, we now have 30,000 and 33,000. So we're getting a lot more attack damage from our belt. With flasks and gear out of the way, let's get into the passives, guys. This is probably where we see the biggest change. You'll notice that in order to facilitate spell suppression, we need a lot of dexterity on this build. That's because we have the Magebane Keystone, which gives us spell suppression based on dexterity, and all of our dexterity nodes can also be tattooed with the tattoo of the Ramako Shaman to get a little bit of spell suppression. Each tattoo is roughly 2 divines, and for every tattoo you put onto a dex slot, you get a point back from the spell suppression cluster. Alright, and when you get a point back, you can spend that on life, you can spend that on a jewel socket, and you can just have a more efficient character. But at that point, you're just spending a lot of money on this character in order to save these points. So that is why we path through the right side here, so we can get through all of these dex nodes. It also leads us nicely to the spell suppression circle over here. Reflexes gives us 10% chance to suppress spell damage and some evasion rating. Then we pick up evasion rating mastery so that our evasion rating from the equipped body armor is doubled. Okay, so that is very nice. We pick up this life and flask node over here. That's so we can get life flask gain 1 charge every 3 seconds. We also get the flask mastery that does the same thing. The reason for this is it frees up our Pantheon. Previously we were using Soul of Zlatha to gain life flask generation. Now we have a little bit of generation from our passives, which means we can use the Soul of Abarath and get immunity to Burning Ground instead. For now, I have these small nodes with spell suppression slotted in so we can reach the 100% spell cap. As we continue to improve the build, I expect to be able to remove these nodes and spend them elsewhere. Then of course we got Magebane, I already talked about that. And then we path all the way around, and a lot of this should look the same. The big difference here, you'll notice that we are no longer at this bottom right side of the tree. We used to get Wrecking Ball, we used to get Brutal Skewering, we pathed through these nodes, and then we also got Hematophagy. Instead, we're getting the Impale nodes here for Forceful Skewering. It's closer to the start of our tree. And then we're getting the Leech nodes with Vitality Void, alright? This is a 1-to-1 replacement of these nodes here. Before we had these selected, and then we anointed Forceful Skewering. Now we have Forceful Skewering, and then we anoint Brutal Skewering, okay? That is an expensive anoint, by the way. It requires 2 golden oils. But doing this saves us a bunch of points, and that points gets reinvested into a cluster jewel. Here's the cluster jewel I'm using for the build. Unfortunately, I can't show you what that cluster jewel looks like while it's equipped, so let me just refund these passives super quick so we can talk about the cluster jewel. So this is a large cluster jewel for the increased damage with sword and axe attacks. We are using 8 passives so that it requires less points to use the full cluster. The nodes we ended up going with is Run Through and Feed the Fury. So for those of you guys unfamiliar with cluster jewels, the nodes you see at the top and the bottom when there are 3 passives are the nodes that are closest to the tree. So if I put this in, you'll see we get one notable here that is Feed the Fury, and another notable here that is Run Through. And then the furthest node is going to be Martial Prowess. So that is going to be top is close, bottom is close, the middle is very far away. So that is how you read your cluster jewels and how the positioning is determined in this little circle over here. The one we don't want, we put furthest away. The ones we want, we put closest to our build so we can path through them to get these jewel sockets. Alright, so we get axe and sword damage here, then we get Feed the Fury, this is a little bit of life leech, and then we get Run Through, this is chance to impale and impale effect, and then we slot in these 2 jewel sockets, and this is where we put our Watcher's Eye, and where we put our rare jewel. So this rare jewel over here is 16 to dex, we need a lot of dex on our build, 7 to maximum life, and a little bit of chance to impale on hit. Alright, the impale on hit is necessary, without it we do not hit the impale cap, so if I take this out, we only have 94% chance to impale. And since this is an impale build, you're going to want to have 100% chance to impale or your damage starts to fall off. Let's talk about the Watcher's Eye. There's been a couple changes here. We are still using the impales you inflict the last 2 additional hits while using Pride. That is the most important. I bought myself a chance to suppress spell damage while affected by Grace. This is in case you want to use a mercenary that has the Grace aura. This can roll up to 15% if you divine it, but the minimum is 12, and 12% spell suppression with Grace active is going to be 3 of these points you get back. So that is something you can consider if you are doing this spell suppression route. The other big change we made when we swapped to Evasion is that we can no longer use Unwavering Stance. Since we have 20k evasion, Unwavering Stance is now incompatible with our build, which means we need to find stun immunity by some other means. We're doing that using the Immutable Force Crimson Jewel. This is a jewel that uses increased stun and block recovery to get you pseudo stun immunity. What that means is that you still get stunned. The duration of the stun is so small that you can barely notice that you've been stunned. The breakpoint you want to aim for here is 961. So do not buy this jewel if it is less than 961, and do not pay extra if it is higher than 961, okay? You want to get the cheapest you can that meets the requirements. So that is Immutable Force giving us stun immunity. I believe we already talked about Ancestral Vision. This is how we're getting ailment immunity on the build with all of our spell suppression gear and our crafted boots with chance to avoid elemental ailments. And then the next most important thing to talk about is going to be our Timeless Jewel. Now this is Lethal Pride. Normally Timeless Jewel is used to change the keystone in the radius of this jewel, but you'll notice here that there are no keystone passives, which means the only reason we're using this is because it modifies the small and notable passives on our tree. So what exactly is this jewel doing for us? It's adding +1 to maximum fortification on some of our notable passives. So Juggernaut, Harpooner, Slaughter, and Cleaving are all giving us +1 to maximum fortification because we have this particular jewel placed in this spot. Now the only thing that matters here is the number. The one I got was 13,998. You do not have to get the exact same one. Instead, I recommend that you Google Timeless Jewel Calculator and you fiddle around with it until you can find out how it works and what other options you can slot into this jewel socket to get +4 to maximum fortification. Right? The goal here is to get +4 to maximum fortification, and then combined with Celestial Brace and a Runegraft I'm going to talk about, we managed to get 42 fortification stacks, and that is a lot of fortification. So speaking of fortification, we then get ourselves a Runegraft of the Bound. This makes it so that you gain 20% more bonuses from your gloves and 20% less bonuses from your boots. Only use this if you have the Celestial Brace. It's going to make you get 12 to maximum fortification instead of 10, okay? I think that's it for the passive skill tree. We have enough decks now that we could pull out of the proficiency cluster here, and then to get the passive points to put into Cleaving, we ended up removing points from Martial Experience over here. So that is all of the passive changes I've done to this build. Now you'll see here that we finished up our build close to a couple of jewel sockets. We have one jewel socket to take here and another to take over here. Those are for Forbidden Flesh and Forbidden Flame when my character gets to level 100. This is going to give us access to some of the ascendancies from the Slayer. I'm thinking Headsman for physical reflect immunity. That makes it so that we can ignore one more map modifier when we are mapping on this build. But all in all, I think that covers everything I wanted to talk about for this build upgrade, guys. We are still using Bladestorm of Uncertainty for bossing and normal Bladestorm for mapping. I guess we'll do a quick Maven just to demonstrate some live single target DPS. I have a ton of writs from doing destructive play. Let's just put it in. We'll do the first phase of Maven and then I'll conclude the video there. And then you can kind of just hold down your right mouse button and go AFK because none of the mechanics really matter. Right, even this one that you're supposed to put in the middle, it resets in the normal Maven, so you can just kind of ignore it. You're going to one phase her every single time. And we go in the middle over here, and then just hold down our right mouse button. So if you're someone that struggles with normal Pinnacle bosses and you're looking for a build that can just kind of stand there and hold down the right mouse button, ignoring mechanics, I do recommend giving this a try. But once again, this requires so much currency that maybe you'd just be better off making a different build. Anyways, guys, I'm going to do the memory game here, and then I'm going to show you the loot from Maven, and then we're going to call it a day. What? What? I'm bad and I should feel bad.
The living toy must enjoy our contests.
And that brings us to the end of this video. I've gone over every upgrade I've made, and I've given you my thoughts on what this build feels like to play on a high investment. The Bladestorm champion is an excellent candidate for a league starter. It's going to get you your 4 Watchstones, it's going to get you started on some T16 mapping strategies, but beyond that I cannot recommend further investment because it just takes too much money to get to the point where you can do uber pinnacle bosses. And even then, it's not really ideal, it just kinda gets the job done. If you're enjoying this playstyle, I recommend looking into the Slayer version that uses Rakiata's Dance, elemental damage, and inverted elemental resistances. It does a lot more damage, it's a little less tanky and a little slower than the champion, but it's going to be much more suitable for doing some of the juicier content that people like to do as the league matures. But with that said, thank you guys so much for watching, and I'll see you soon with a brand new video. Bye!